Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may find yourself. Welcome to this event hosted by the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. My name is Harry Verhoeven. I work at the Center at the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University. And it's a great pleasure to be hosting this event focused on climate adaptation and urban-rural transformations in the Horn of Africa. As many of you may know, this is the fourth event in a series of conversations we're hosting here, very much focused on climate and climate adaptation perspectives from different African regions, from different stakeholders in business, in academia, in government, in international organizations, sharing their thoughts on what decarbonization, the energy transition, and adapting to climatic changes mean for different parts of the African continent. I'm particularly delighted to be an outstanding panel here today on the Horn of Africa. I'll introduce them in just a second. But before I do so, let me remind you that this event is on the record, it is open to the press, and it is being live streamed. That also means that a recording of this event will be made available via our website, as well as via our YouTube channel, so you can watch this again. Or for those of you, of course, not able to attend today, you will be watching this at a later moment in time. As I said, very important event today focused on the Horn of Africa, coming, I think, at a particularly important, sensitive time, of course, for the region. As many of you will know, the current meteorological in the Horn are difficult. By some accounts, the worst, or the driest weather, at least the worst drought in 40 years, affecting especially Somalia, Ethiopia, parts of Kenya. And we're very fortunate to have some speakers from those countries here present too, to reflect both on the longer term trends and developments, as well as perhaps on these more acute issues. Let me also remind you, before we get into the specifics, that at any moment in time, you can ask questions. You see the Q&A and chat function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to share those questions. As moderator, I'll be picking some of those up and sharing those with our audience members after they've made their initial comments and opening remarks. I also encourage you to interact with each other if you find that useful and stimulating. But so without further ado, let me briefly introduce our panelists. The first to speak in just a second will be Dr. Balkis Osman from Sudan. Very importantly in this context, one of the leading experts on the African continent, currently based at the African Development Bank, on both climate change and green growth. Then we'll have the pleasure of hearing from Addis Ababa from Yifu Tafese, who is the Deputy CEO of Ethiopia's Agricultural Transformation Agency and has been working for many years in the front lines of trying to transform agricultural productivity in what is Africa's second most populous country. And then thirdly, we have Simon Waguru Nderitu with us from Kenya, from Strathmore Business School, who will be telling us a little bit more about food security and its linkages with climate, with water and energy in the Kenyan context. So I hope that that's a really interesting and worthwhile panel. But let me first hand it over to Dr. Balkis. We're absolutely ready for you, and I'll share your presentation as you begin to speak. So over to you, Balkis. I hope that is visible. Your presentation is now visible, I think, to the audience.
Thank you, Harry. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And first, I would like to thank the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, especially Harry, for kindly inviting me to join this important discussion. And as mentioned by Harry, my talk will focus on building climate resilience in the Greater Horn of Africa. Next, please.
Sorry, yeah, there we are.
Yeah, so I will briefly cover the climate change impacts and vulnerability of the region, including implications resulting from the interaction between climatic and non-climatic factors. And then we will start rethinking disaster risk reduction, moving forward towards building resilience, which is a critical component of which are community engagement and implementation of nature-based solutions, including ecosystem-based adaptation. And yeah, next. Okay, So I think everybody knows that the Great Horn of Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world and sub-region in Africa. Africa itself is the most vulnerable continent, and within Africa is the Great Horn of Africa has always been like the region that is riddled with disasters. The region have 11 countries: Burundi, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And all of these countries have inherent problems which will be just aggravated by climate change. 10 out of the 11 countries are among the LDCs, and the majority of them are classified as fragile states, facing a chronic state of conflicts, food insecurity, and famine. So generally, the region is characterized by its high vulnerability, which they mentioned is stemming not only from climate change, but the presence of multiple factors and historical challenges that have always been interacting and resulting in this situation. Of course, there are variations within the sub-region, but still, in general terms, there are some similar characteristics. And these problems have really trapped the people in this region in a vicious downward cycle of insecurities and ecological stresses, coupled with inequalities and inequities also in the distribution of resources that have led to social migration, displacement, and caused aggravated conflicts in the region. So they mentioned, we can say these challenges have always extended beyond the national borders to become more of a regional symptoms. And climate change is now bringing more and more challenges, exacerbating this vulnerability and increase the suffering of the people. Next, please. Yeah, I think.
This was good.
Yeah. It is clear from these maps and figures. The Horn of Africa is one of the most regions exposed to extreme climate, particularly drought and increasing temperature, which also accelerates the drought impact. Recently, the region started witnessing increased flash floods, which had devastating impacts because of the low coping capacities, low infrastructure. So they mentioned the interaction between these vulnerabilities, underlying vulnerability, and extreme climate is really disastrous for the region. And we know, of course, that with climate change, we are witnessing, not expecting, we are witnessing increased frequency and intensity of extreme events and the duration and the impacts, of course. So yeah, we have a number of implications resulting from this. Next, please. So we can see the multiplying effects in all development sectors: water, energy, forestry, agriculture, biodiversity, ecosystems, human settlement, and this have already resulted in a permanent state of food insecurity, human insecurity, and also the impact of the rising temperature and flash floods have impacted like the oceans and marine environment and the productivity, the coastal zone, the infrastructure, the coastal infrastructure, the water, freshwater availability, and of course the economic sector, which is the tourism. We know most of these countries are coastal and they depend largely on tourism, and this has now been impacted. So actually, it impacted the economy as well as the livelihoods, because many of the people also their livelihood depend on the coastal areas and fisheries. As much as it has impacted this natural capital, but it has also impacted the social fabric, the social capital, and the human capital. We can see these conflicts and the social disintegration that results from the increased conflict between different stakeholder groups. We can see the migration of brains. So there is this migration even for everyone. And we have seen East Africa in general with the majority of migrants just throwing themselves in the sea and trying to escape this trap. The displacement, and then also the infrastructure, the physical capital is also impacted, the services in general, the financial capital, because when all the other capitals collapse, then the financial capital definitely will collapse. So people will start to face a situation where they have no option, and when there is no option, there is no adaptation, because adaptation is about options. If you have options, then you are able to adapt. If you have no option, then the only way is either to migrate or to wait your destiny. Yeah, next, please. Another important implication is the resulting from this situation is the increased urbanization, resulting from migration from rural to urban areas. Other continents like Asia, for example, most of the migration was due to industrialization and urban development. So people go to urban centers and cities for employment. While in Africa, it's just to escape. Mostly, it's not because of industrialization, and this is the real problem. People are escaping disasters to go to urban centers and cities, and the cities themselves are not ready for migrants. They are already burdened with so many problems. They have low basic development, there is lack of urban planning, weak infrastructure, weak governance, there is poverty. So as a result, urbanization will result in a high social, environmental, and economic cost. And of course, we start seeing increased proportion of informal settlement and slums, which expose becoming more exposed to the impacts of climate change, such as the flash floods and also the pollution, water pollution, food insecurity. We see many social problems, increased rates of crimes associated with these urban slums and unplanned settlements. Two factors actually complicated the situation resulting from this urbanization. The first is the lack or low budgetary allocation to disaster risk reduction in these areas, which are considered outside the government planning and services provision. And the second is the insufficient investment in infrastructure itself. So there are no investment in transport or energy or health, water service, nothing. So this is just a recipe for disaster. Next, please. As you can see here, these are some of the photos showing the situation, the floods in Sudan, floods in Kenya, and people living in the wrong place, in the wrong time, and the result is that the complete destruction, loss even of the meager livelihood assets they have, and the situation is continuing like this unless something has to be done to change this. The aid relief is not working. It's short-term solutions. What we need here is long-term planning and solutions. And that is why we are speaking now about building resilience. Next, please.
Sorry, I'm trying to get there. We are.
Okay, yeah. So what we are trying is just to rethink this, the whole issue of disaster risk reduction and try to see how we can build a lasting solution through building resilience. And as I mentioned, it is a region which is now disaster riddled, not disaster prone, because we see things happening and it has been happening for decades now. For example, we have like 27 million people, largely children and women, that are experiencing a state of famine on an annual basis. And in response, government, development agencies, relief services, international organizations have always worked hard to relieve the crisis through food and other emergency programs. These programs could be significant responses to emergencies, but they generally fail to generate these lasting solutions that they have been speaking about. They have been short-term measures, and they don't address the root causes of the problem. Yeah, next, please. So before, I think we need just to refresh our before speaking about transformation, that is needed to pull out the region from vulnerability trap to resilience. We need to refresh our minds with some key terms, that relevant terms like vulnerability. When we speak about vulnerability, it is not only a function of climate change. It is a condition determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the sustainability of an individual, decrease here actually, a community, an asset or a system to the impacts of any others. The IPCC identifies elements of vulnerability, which is like the sensitivity of the system, the exposure, and the lack of coping capacity or adaptation. All these together, they contribute to increase the vulnerability. And the risk is the probability that certain events which can happen to people or to system which is highly vulnerable. So it is the probability of the occurrence of the event that will harm the system. Disaster, I can just say disaster is a materialization of the risk. So we have a risk, and then the materialization of the risk, because of many factors associated with the vulnerability, we have a disaster. So a disaster is not necessarily attributed to the event alone, because even a small amount of rain in a place where it's highly vulnerable, no drainage system, no roads, can bring a disaster. While torrential, what they call heavy rains in another area could not bring anything. So depending on the situation. Yeah, next, please. Yeah, the disaster relief, we know that it provides assistance to protect the life-saving and immediate needs of people affected by the disaster. It has been the main response and the mitigation measure for many decades. Before they start thinking about disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, generally this disaster risk management and reduction, they have the preparatory component in anticipation of the disaster. But the disaster, the relief, usually they wait until the disaster happens, and then they start to provide the aid and relief. So what is needed is to, it's not enough, of course. It's not enough to have this kind of preparatory, and we need something that will last, that will help the system, the people to recover from the similar event in the future. And this is what we are looking for when we talk about resilience. Adaptation is a process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and or any hazard, to moderate the harm or to exploit also beneficial opportunities, which is very difficult to speak about in the context of Africa. In the temperate region, we speak about, yes, increase the growing season, increase biodiversity, but in Africa, we don't see any beneficial opportunities coming out from the climate change, except if we are able to access financial resources to start real development and adaptation measures. The resilience is the ability of a system and its component to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effect of hazardous events. So the key word here is to recover. So with resilience, we will be able to recover. So this is the dimension, sustainability dimension, that in the future we'll be facing similar events, but the system will be ready to recover because it had this resilience. Next, please. So as I mentioned, the tragic dilemma of the people, especially in the war-ravaged countries, they demand the concerted attention to address the root causes of the problem and to reduce the vulnerability. This is why the building resilience is important. We need to address these issues. And we need to have like a transformative approach in the region, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, to address the range of impacts on human security and livelihoods and rebuild the livelihood capitals. As I mentioned, it's not only the natural capital, it's all the livelihood capital. The 5 livelihood capitals are impacted with this situation in the region. Next, please. So the question of how are we going to transform from disaster risk reduction to building resilience? The first and most important is community engagement, because the transformation aims at the beginning to secure people's livelihood and livelihood capitals. And this is about the people. It's about the people. So people have to be part of it. So community engagement is key, taking into consideration that all the efforts, the previous efforts, have been generally top-down in nature, because communities are generally seen as a receiver of services, receiver of aid. They have not been seen as part of the solution. All the time they were to receive, receptive. Now we need them to be part of this transformative recovery process and to be seen as partners in the rebuilding. So their engagement is very critical. And when we speak about the communities, we don't speak only about the local people. We speak about the local people, we speak about their community leaders, the NGOs, the government extension agents, the scientific institutions. Everyone is a stakeholder and has a role to play. And they need to work together to ensure that sufficient awareness is created in areas related to climate change impacts, vulnerability, and also to employ like a 2-track bottom-up approach to ensure that information is shared. It's not one way. You need to get feedback, you need to get views and perceptions so that you can, it will help build lasting solutions that are, and the ownership by the communities. And then we also need to speak about the tested coping mechanism and interventions that have worked, because of we don't expect that these people they have never developed coping capacities, or they have never been able to cope to previous events. They have been developing, they have been learning historically, but sometimes when the event exceeds their capacity to adapt, or with time the resources, the institutional setups become depleted. They became like incapable of adapting, and in many cases people speak about even either relief as one of the factors that led to the depleting the coping capacities, because when people wait and they depend on this aid instead of implementing their knowledge and practices, so they lose it. And then we have to revive these local and traditional experience, practices, and knowledge, and to build on it. This can be using anecdotal and narration on historical climate events and previous coping strategies. We need also to build and strengthen the organizational capacity. They have to organize themselves into committees, because we have the experience in Sudan where we evaluated one of the projects that targeted this building the sustainable livelihoods. So that targeted the 5 livelihood capitals, and they work together. They use a package. So one of the most important factors in the success and sustainability of the project is the formation of these committees, community committees, taking responsibility for the different activities associated with the project. And even long after the project has had been terminated, still the activities are ongoing, and the people have developed a true adaptation capacity. So this organizational capacity is very important at that level, the level of the communities, and also working to change the perceptions, and especially taking them from the feeling of being dependent to partners in the process of development. Next, please. So for effective engagement of community in this resilience building process, certain measures must be considered. That we need to have like a stakeholder mapping, because we need to be inclusive to ensure timely engagement and quality engagement. So when we want to, it's better like to, after receiving seasonal forecast, something that will attract the communities to come and attract their attention. To use their, of course, local language to make common understanding of issues. And when we speak about inclusive, we also need to include women, youth, and elders as well in this process. We have to discuss socioeconomic and political factors in order to improve understanding and identify also the whole picture and what is needed to create the enabling environment for a successful intervention, and to communicate the uncertainties associated with all these issues around climate change, because we don't want to create false expectation that may not help the process. And to explain that adaptation is a long process. Learning, we don't want to see them to see adaptation as very short and then that is it. It should be like seen as a long-term process, and it has to be built one block at a time. And also that it needs time, it needs finance, of course. And then also to ask them to take part in the process of monitoring and evaluation. This will make them part of the stakeholders. Next, please. Okay, yeah. So when we speak about resilience, we think, especially in this region, we think about the nature-based solutions and including ecosystem-based adaptation. This is because this region is highly dependent on the natural resources, on different ecosystems, the rangeland, agriculture, fishing, the high dependency entail that we consider as a priority the nature-based solutions. And of course, it involves actions to protect and sustainably manage, restore natural resources, and address also at the same time societal challenges simultaneously, and provide like the human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So it's like a complete package. It takes care of the natural as well as the social and economic dimensions. One of the nature-based solution is the ecosystem-based adaptation. So nature-based solution is broader, and the ecosystem-based adaptation focuses mainly on harnessing biodiversity and ecosystem services to reduce the vulnerability and to build resilience to climate change. While the nature-based solution can be broader, we have nature-based solution, we have nature-based nature-derived solutions like renewable energy, and it is now becoming like the priority for many, for the adaptation communities in general, even for mitigation community. Yeah. Next, please. So when we speak about the ecosystem-based adaptation, we can say that it is not new for Africa. Different forms of ecosystem-based adaptation have been implemented under different names since historical times and have contributed significantly to biodiversity and human well-being. For example, we have the agroforestry, which is used to be known as the Tongia system in Kenya. We have the gum Arabic Jinena with the gum Arabic farming, and it's a mix of shifting agriculture and agroforestry. And because planting acacia, Senegal trees, and between it agricultural crops for some time, and then when the trees become a certain length, then they move to another area and do the same. And here we have established forest of acacia Senegal, and which is nitrogen fixing species, so the soil is fertile. And so, and to retain water, it improves the fertility of the soil. It is part of a climate change mitigation as well, because it also fixes nitrogen and carbon sequestration. So there are a number of measures that have long been implemented without being named as ecosystem-based adaptation, but they are. It's not new. It's just we are expanding it now. Now we have also the watershed management through participatory forest management programs as part of the ecosystem-based adaptations. And I think this also can work in the region, especially in the, for example, the Nile Basin and in the as regional programs, investment or research also to inform policies and practices that will help improve the effectiveness of this technique and make it more cost effective and increase its environmental and social benefits. Next. So another measure I think which is also important is that contribute to resilience building is to building these synergies between adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this IPCC SREX report, the extreme report, one of the findings of this report is that there is opportunities to create these synergies in financing for disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change, and for integrating both into the national development plans. And I think this is very important because working in silos is not really efficient. So what we need to do is to bring these efforts together and to make it part of the national plans. Because at the end of the day, we are now speaking about NDCs and long-term strategies, which are looking forward. Another thing is that we need, as I mentioned, to address urban vulnerability through enhancing the investment in basic infrastructure and reduce disaster risk in a sustainable way. And to also to improve the accuracy of regional forecasts, which can contribute to improving the adaptive capacity of the vulnerable community in vulnerable areas, and to make use of the ongoing Building Back Better initiative post-COVID-19 in Africa. For example, we have an initiative on Africa Green Stimulus Program, and we need to dedicate funds for this kind of long-term reconstruction and recovery. That's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Baptiste, for that very comprehensive overview that really sets the scene, I think, as we take it into some of the more regional specific dynamics. Yifru, can I ask you to turn your mic on? I can share your slides if you want me to do that as well.
Yes, Harry, please do.
Okay, let me do that straight away. Thank you so much. Sorry, it's just coming up now. So you first, as I said, from Ethiopia's Agricultural Transformation Agency, and he'll be talking a bit about the work that the agency's been doing in the last couple of years. Very important, about the interlinkages between climate change, food security, this question of urban-rural transformation. Oh, there we are. Okay, I can now share it. Oh, sorry, somehow why is this? There we are, with apologies for the delay. I hope you can all see that. Go ahead, Yifru.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I think I have some unstable internet connection, so apologies for that. I will be using my mobile. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak to the audience. And my presentation is basically to highlight on the ETA's role and its initiative, particularly on on the SCC programs that we've been running, and the impact of climate change on agriculture, as well as the ETA's contribution to climate adaptation within the SCC, and some learnings are also shared accordingly. Next, please. The ETA has been established back in 2010, primarily to provide studies, identify systemic problems in the agricultural sector, and provide a recommendation to the government as well as other actors in the sector. Pilot projects that are innovative and that can catalyze change and transformation in the sector. Provide implementation support to implementing agencies both at the federal and regional levels, and create linkage and coordination among various agriculture and related institutions so that they bring the desired impact on the ground. So with that mind, with that mandates, there are three major strategic programs that we currently are running. The first is innovation and capacity building, where we provide innovative solutions to the sector, as well as build the capacity of implementing partners. Geography programs are another program that we run, and that's primarily on the agricultural commercialization cluster, where we've been operating on 300 waradas in 4 major regions of the country. And then the last is to identify the systemic problems and provide policy recommendations, conduct studies on bottlenecks that affect the sector. Next, please. So the ECC is just an abbreviation for Agricultural Commercialization Program that was launched back in 2019 with a vision to improve the livelihood of smallholder farmers through market-driven value chain development and inclusive environmental sustainable approach. So there are 5 major programs that we run within the SCC program. So the SCC is a 300 warada program that we've been, or districts that we've been working both in 4 regions, including Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, and as well as in the southern part of the country. So we have the major ambition or objective of the program is to increase farmers' income, adopt climate-smart agricultural practices, enhance the market mechanism, increase the commodity supply to integrated agro-industrial parks, as well as job creations for in the farm. Next, please. So there are 10 commodities, priority commodities selected carefully that will bring desired impacts across those regions. The 5 of them are grains, and the remaining 5 are horticultural commodities. So, as I said, we've been operating in the 4 regions in standard, waradas or districts across the country. Next, please. So agriculture is a backbone of the country's economy. Of course, its GDP share has been declining in the past 20 years. Back in 2020, in 2010, it was around 48-50% of the GDP, but now it has come down to 32% of the country's GDP. So its contribution, although has been declining, but it still plays a significant role in terms of employment generation as well as export earning for the country. Next, please. So, as I said, over the past 15 years, the growth of the Ethiopian economy has been really terrific, and particularly the growth of agriculture has been also quite impressive in the past 15 years. And there has been a significant structural transformation in terms of reducing the poverty level of the country, as well as increasing production and productivity. Significant socio-economic contributions have been made, and this has been doing quite impressive. However, the Ethiopian landscape is basically, we have limited adoption of irrigation system because we're very much dependent on oil-fed agriculture. And it's mainly our rainy season is basically from June to September, with rainfall range of 1,600 to 2,200 in the highland areas and less than 300 millimeter in the southern and eastern part of the country. So Ethiopia has quite diverse agroecologies with many climatic conditions that are really favorable for many agricultural crop production. The temperature ranges from 50 degrees Celsius to that of 40 degrees Celsius in the Danakil Depression in the eastern part of the country. But however, the average temperature has been increasing in the past, 40 years, 50 years. According to World Bank, 1% decrease has been noticed, with an average rate of 0.25 degrees Celsius per decade. So that is really a huge, that has been really creating a huge impact on reduction of soil moisture, decreasing of rainfall, and a high rate of warming, etc. So as a result of that, the southern region of the country, the south central region of the country has been experiencing about 20% decrease in rainfall since 1916, according to the report of the World Bank. So the rainfall pattern has been erratic, particularly in the Rift Valley areas. There has been rising temperature, evaporation, and mainly driven by the El Niño effect as well. Next, please. So I don't want to dwell much on this, but the major contributors of climate change emission of greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, which accounts for the lion's share of the contribution, and followed by methane and other green gas effects. Next, please. So of course, the principal source of carbon dioxide, pollution resulting because of the fossil fuel, industrial process, deforestation. All those are the key drivers for the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. Methane, of course, fossil fuel mining, livestock digestions, rice in agriculture, etc. So these are some of the cause factors for the increase in greenhouse effects in the environment. Next, please. So the Ethiopian agriculture basically is dominated by smallholder farmers with over 15 million households, and they account about 95% of the production in the country. Therefore, there is no such big, large commercial farms. So smallholders are the critical supply or producers of products. Mainly it's rain-fed, low irrigation, and poor adoption of technologies, challenged by increasing population, coupled with rural-urban migration, unable to, of course, as a result, unable to ensure food self-sufficiency. So per annum, we will definitely have like 10 to 15 million population dependent on food aid, heavily affected by climate variability, decline soil fertility, increasing pest and disease, particularly since the COVID pandemic. In addition to COVID, we had desert locust invasion last year and before, and this has really aggravated the problem in the country. More importantly, although the Ministry of Agriculture has been on reform to transform the sector, but there has been lack of robust policies, particularly on land use and administration, both in rural and urban areas, investment in agriculture, finance, etc. And these are some of the driving factors that affected the sector. Next, please. So climate change is being felt by everybody. So it's no more a theory. It's really a phenomenon that's happening everywhere, and we are feeling the impact. And as a result, we see so many devastating effects. For example, in the eastern part of the country, we have, particularly in Somalia region, and in Oromia, we have 2.5 to 2 million people are affected. Recently, since November, a problem has occurred, and we have a severe shortage of water and animal feed, and therefore even this much, close to 5 million people are dependent on humanitarian assistance. So this is purely the effect that we see at the moment. And according to another study made by the USAID back in 2016, agricultural production loss will be over 6% if we do not address the problem of climate change in this country by to the middle of this century. So cognizant of this challenge, the government has been quite ambitious to support the efforts of the country's development, but the climate resilience green economy strategy has been developed and incorporated into the country's development plan, and we see the implementation has begun by the government. Such initiatives as GERD, green legacies, adoption of solar and wind powers are also examples of those kind of initiatives to address climate change. Next, please. So when it comes to the AT's contribution to climate adaptation under the SDGs on those 300 areas, we have under the ACC program, we have 6 outcomes, and one of the outcomes is to improve, environmentally sustainable farm practice. Therefore, within that outcome, we have a number of projects that we've been implementing. So, such as weather and climate information advisory services, adoption of crop rotation. When we also do the green legacy, primarily we've been planting avocados, that have really both effects, double effects for the farmers, mangoes, etc. Application of full package, soil management, irrigation, conservation activities, ecosystem fertility, soil management practices have been adopted. So let me take you through some of the major projects we've been undertaking. Next, please. So one of the projects we did was AgroMed. So this was a project we did from 2015 to 2018, where we've been very much closely working with the National Meteorological Agency and with Ministry of Agriculture in order to provide localized weather and climate information to our smallholder farmers. This was a project where we installed 50 automatic weather stations in a farmers training center to track and inform meteorological data through digitally to the National Meteorological Agency, so that information goes back to the farmers so as to make informed decisions. So this has been one of the innovative projects we launched, and it has been really quite impactful in terms of providing timely information to the farmers. Next, please. So another project we did was climate smart innovation, where we were able to establish 34 farmers training center, and climate smart agricultural technologies have been identified, and videos have been produced also how the farmers can implement climate smart agricultural technologies in their agronomies. And over 200 demonstration plots have been established, particularly on climate smart agriculture practices in the 5 regions that I mentioned, including the Benishangul Gumuz areas. So with this project, we've been providing a capacity building to our farmers, development agents, and the Warada or district officials, particularly on conservation of agriculture and integration of sustainable land management, etc. So these are, again, this was also one of the projects that we did from 2016 to 2020. So next, please. Another important project we did, still going on, has been the integrated shallow ground water irrigation development. So this is a project we began in 2019, where we mapped the water, shallow groundwater, up to the depths of 30 meters. So we did this mapping across, the SCC Waradas and beyond, and so that the farmers can grow, garden horticultural commodities. So in this project, we covered 234,770 kilometers square areas, and this has a potential of 27.27 billion metric cube of water. This has been printed and delivered to regions for implementation. So based on this map, the use groups and farmers have been utilizing the information so as to identify the areas where 30-meter or less depths of water is available, and they have been extracting that water and using solar technologies in order to cultivate horticultural commodities. So this has been a really quite a very impactful project. A total of over 3 million hectares of irrigable land could be developed as a result of this project, serving over 6.1 million beneficiaries on the ground. So this is a project that we still are going on implementing. Next. So now, what did we learn so far? While implementing those projects, we have had all the ups and downs and also learnings that we've taken. So the first thing is to win the confidence and ownership of policy makers and decision makers, particularly in the implementation areas. So, because on the one hand, we want to increase production and productivity, and therefore, little attention has been given to climatic issues, and therefore, how do we make sure we are making a balanced decision to increase agricultural production as well as address the challenge of climate change? So these are the kind of dilemma we have had, and we really have taken lessons in making sure sense of urgency has been developed, and the stakeholders are including policy makers are on board in order to make and win their support. So this has been a key factor. The third important thing that we've learned is any project can only be successful as long as there is a joint planning and implementation on the ground. Because at the end of the day, these are pilot projects. They will be handed over to the permanent implementing agencies in the localities. Therefore, unless that exercise is in place right from the beginning, it's very difficult to own and win, again, ownership on the ground. Close networking among relevant federal, regional institutions, extension workers, research is quite important. There has to be a platform in order to create and foster ownership on the ground. Policy are quite important. Climate change, for example, if I tell you some of the experiences in eastern part or in the western part of the country, farmers are planting eucalyptus tree in the replacing wheat farmlands, farmlands. Therefore, why farmers are planting eucalyptus tree? Because they know the eucalyptus tree can fetch better income than planting wheat. But they did not consider the impact it has on water utilization. Eucalyptus tree has a devastating impact in really draining the water of agricultural farms. So there are no really policies which really shape the kind of farm management and administration that we need to adopt. So this is an area that a reform area that the government has also embarked on, but this has been quite devastating so far. There is no clear policy in place to enforce land administration on the ground. Grassroots community mobilization and awareness creation is quite critical if you want to sustain such kind of mitigation measures. So that's also the lessons we have taken so far. Thank you very much, Arya and colleagues. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Ifru. We really greatly appreciate you sharing those lessons learned, those insights, and the journey that took you there with the implementation of these different projects. Let me now invite Simon from Nairobi to share some of his thoughts, particularly on the Kenyan context. All right, Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hani, and thanks to the other presenters. They have set the stage for me, So the focus for Tafese is more on the agricultural farmers side of the story. Here I focus more on the arid and semi-arid areas, the pastoralists. Yeah? So we want to understand the pathway to resilience in Kenya arid and semi-arid areas, lands. And here we'll talk about climate change adaptation and food security by the pastoralist. So some of these impacts were mentioned by the first speaker, Osman. Climate change effects have direct impact on the livestock sector and pastoralism in particular for the arid and semi-arid area, because this is the main livelihood for arid and semi-arid areas. So we are experiencing a number of climate risks, some of them being drought, floods, high temperature, heat waves, which are causing deaths, particularly for the livestock population. And then the increase in temperature and reduction in availability of water leads to reduced feed availability. And in these areas, when you have reduced feed availability, it limits livestock productivity, feed intake, and hence poor performance of the livestock, and hence you don't get a good market for your cattle. And all this has effect on food and nutrition supply to the people who live in semi-arid areas because of reduced meat production, beef, and also milk production. These are some of the pictures that are very common in our media of late. We are already experiencing a drought like in Kenya currently in the arid areas we are talking about. So I want to mention a couple of studies we did through the Pathway to Resilience in Semi-Arid Areas PRICE project between 2016 and 2019. Here we came up with I warmly recommend you have a look at those studies. One of it is on the bee value chain analysis and climate change adaptation and investment options, the semi-arid lands of northern Kenya. I'll try to talk a few of the examples of investment options we mentioned there, but the details are in that paper, and we followed these 3 steps approach of value chain analysis for the resilience in the dry lands. We call it VC arid. So the first step, of course, we mapped the value chain, and we were several countries involved in this. We had in Senegal also doing the same, or the bee variegin, and also the map their bee variegins. And then we had Pakistan mapping the cotton variegin. So after we mapped the variegins, so we went up further into, and this was the creative part of this variegin analysis, is to identify the climate risk, and what can be done on those climate risk. There we identified options for adaptation and private sector investment. And again, based on the investment options and adaptation strategy, we found led to the second publication on the impact of climate change adaptation on food security. And we have that paper published in Climatic Change Journal last year. Okay. So when you think about food security and climate change, we appreciate that agriculture and the food system must improve and ensure food security, and they need to adapt to the changing climate. There is too much natural resource pressure in these arid areas. Already, the reason why they are arid and semi-arid areas is because they're already harsh environments. Okay, so climate change is just worsening a worse environment to begin with. Yeah. So we have 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture. This is mentioned in most of the documents, particularly written by FL. So we need to increase agricultural productivity and incomes. Here we're talking about livestock productivity, adopting and building resilience to climate change. This a lot has been said by the first speaker. And then of course, the last one is reducing or removing greenhouse gases emissions. So we talk a lot about the first 2 in the African context, because we have, even if there is considerable contribution of the agricultural sector on greenhouse gas emissions, our share to the world contribution is very low. That although we suffer the most in terms of issues to do with the food security in these semi-arid and arid areas. For example, if you think about drought, you realize that we have higher livestock death in pastoral systems, and this is worsening every drought that we are getting, and droughts are becoming very common. We used to get one drought that is severe after every 10 years before the year 2009. After that, drought has become like every other year, we're always having a drought, and a severe drought after 2 to 3 years. Very severe drought. So the severe drought, the last severe drought was 2019. We are now currently facing another severe drought that started late last year. Okay. So that leads to higher livestock death. And almost all pastoralists that we interviewed in this study that we did, they all say they have ever lost livestock due to drought. That has a associated issue, of course, with water scarcity. Then with water scarcity in those rangelands, we have low quality and quantity of pasture. Again, even worsened by increasing population in those rangelands, degradation of the rangelands. And then what complicates issues and more is that we have higher incidence of livestock diseases, which leads to more loss of animals. And then because of one of the climate risks we found was the increased levels of dry spells. So they're becoming longer, and then which leads to weak livestock because of poor growth, live weight losses, emaciated livestock. And the problem with the emaciated livestock, when you slaughter such an animal, the carcass yield is very low, less than 50%. And we expect around 54% of meat yield from when you slaughter an animal. Yeah? And again, because of the poor growth of the animal, there's decline in milk yield and meat productivity. So how do you conceptualize the way to build resilience in these semi-arid areas and also increase their food security status? So the first thing is to, of course, think about the inputs. We need to look for innovative ways to adopt the changing climate and increase the availability of inputs. Some of the ways that pastoral communities now are slowly adopting things like growing of hay, supplementing the feeds. Hard management is very critical. And with these inputs, both water and pasture management, automatically you have to bring also hard management, and particularly the size of the herd. And not keeping very large herds, which has been for a long time the strategy for pastoral community, taking a herd. The bigger your herd is, the wealthier you are, the more status you have in the community. So thinking about, instead of having large herds, more or less having managed herds, that if a drought comes, which is almost now given with climate change, every other 2 years we're having a drought, you'll be able to take care of the small herd. You don't have a more bigger loss, because if the herd is bigger, then more of the animals will die because of drought, and that exposes the household into food insecurity, which you don't want. So that means then we need to create a good market for the stocking of the herd, and also for herd management in these semi-arid areas. And the idea is to educate our people that you don't need to be working 8 million of Kenya shillings every morning and evening, and you still call yourself a poor person. And yet this is animals that you can be selling them when they are still in their prime age. Most of the livestock we have, they get to the market when they're very old male cows that yield very poor quality meat, and hence it fetch you very little income. And with the raw income, again, you cannot be assured of your food security as a household. But if you have a proper herd management with access to markets, giving the household income that can be invested, and then you draw it slowly, that can assure the household food security. So we can say, in short, that markets plays a very big role in increasing pastoral communities' income, and then they use that income to buy foods. And some of the statistics we found in the study is that, as expected in rangelands in the northern lands of Kenya and many other parts of Africa, is that they largely keep livestock. So 91% of them were keeping livestock. And they were doing a bit of trading, so to get income from their livestock, which was good for us, because that tells us that there is level of commercialization of the pastoral communities. The problem is that they do it when the animals are very old. It's just with the change of perceptions and educating them slowly. I had one of my students who was a very converted pastoralist, having been educated, that he used to destock his animal every other year. And there was a time the father had said elders to talk to him that he is not behaving the right way. They need to have big herds. And he was trying to convince the community that there is need for them to manage pastoralism as a business, which is slowly going to change with the uptake of the ideas by the young generation. We also found for those communities that 18% were food insecure, 7% said they were in the break-even level, not having all the meals, and then 12% they said that they even had surplus to sell. What was striking was that all of them, they agreed that rainfall patterns had changed in these pastoral areas, and some were doing something. Around 77% had taken some measures to adapt to climate change, although you could say some of the adaptation strategy they had adopted was a maladaptation, because it was largely mobility, moving with their livestock to other areas. So some of the reasons why some of them had not adopted to climate change were: majority claimed that lack of finances. Others, they didn't know what to do. That was 35% of the household that the herders that we interviewed, they didn't know what to do, and that shows a need really to push for information campaigns in those semi-arid areas on areas of adaptations, and some financial support. We also noticed another trend now that was not very common in these rangelands, and that was purchase and storage of fodder, and largely that's hay. Actually, one of the group lunches, which is communal land, they're actually growing hay and selling to their members at subsidized prices, which is encouraging as an adaptation strategy in this area, because pastoral lands are becoming smaller and smaller as population is growing, and also possibility for moving the animal from one land to another is becoming more and more difficult. Yeah? Water management, this was largely driven by changes in water management in their group lands. So we had very small numbers here because some felt that the water that was available in their group lunches was far away from where they are living. Others was on herd management. So we had started seeing actually a reduction in herd sizes, and they were doing that by selling the animal and banking them in the bank as a source of livestock asset that they have in their bank, 60%. Yeah. So after that, now we ask ourselves, what are some scaling up opportunities or investment opportunities? Yeah? So investment in livestock value chains would actually affect larger populations in these vulnerable areas who are affected by climate change. So some of the opportunities for investments include coming up with the feedlots, which is a way of keeping the livestock in an intensive feeding for a short period of time. And then in this period of time, you are able to maximize on weight gain and finishing of the animal to get to the market within 90 days, just 3 months. Okay. There are also growing goat and sheep markets in Middle East, which could lead to greater trade opportunities for livestock keepers in the region. Also, other niche market for milk produced in these areas, like for instance, camel milk is championed to have very good nutritional values that can be of great opportunities. Yeah. There's also need for climate compatible interventions for food security in these regions. That is promoting hay production, storage, and water harvesting, fattening and finishing models of livestock, which could ensure best market value for the returns, because most of the time animals in these areas, they gain weight during the rainy season, they lose the weight during the dry spell. So usually that trend, and the net effect that the animal is becoming old and is not gaining into weight that can give it a better return in the market. But fattening and finishing could be a strategy that can get these animals, when they're steers of 3, maximum 2.5 to 3 years, they get to the market. Yeah. Then here we match animal species and breeds to production environment to ensure viability of an optimal production. Another very good opportunity for investment in these areas to enhance food security is actually livestock feeds production. Yeah, it's quite expensive in this part of the world. Meat and marketing opportunities need to be worked on. Again, to avoid drought deaths, there is need for salvage breeding stock after drought being fed, and this can be done by the government, because sometimes the pastoral community are losing most of their female breeding stock, and it takes very long time again for them to recover and get to higher levels of production. Yeah. More commercialization of the livestock production system need to be enhanced in these areas. Better land use laws on how to make use of the rangelands and to enable sustainable access and utilization of the pasture lands. So in conclusion, I would say that we need to enforce business and issue strategies in these semi-arid areas. Yeah. Here the focus should be on value chain and climate smart investment. In these ASO areas, taking care of all the actors coming together in the ASOs, the ministries of agriculture and livestock, pastoral communities, national drought management authorities in different countries, NGO working in the livestock sector, not working in silos, but bringing all of them together to explore these climate smart investment opportunities. Yeah. Increased productivity is key, and there is need for and also a great potential for increasing both the meat and the milk production, which require change in management. We also need to change the pastoral community perceptions that keeping so many cows is not a sign that you're a wealthy person of right now, given now the challenges of climate change and droughts coming every other year. And also supporting regional blocks. We have a number of regional blocks in the country, and also in the African state like COMESA and IGAD, which could help into the trade of pastoral products. And with that, I say thank you very much. Over to you, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the presentation. Really fascinating to have that case study to bring to life perhaps some of the more general points that were raised by Balkis and by Yifru. Now, we've got a number of questions that I'm going to relate to you, Balkis, Yifru, and Simon. There's two questions in the chat, one by Tekle Haimanoth and one by Yannick, both addressed towards you, Yifru. Questions about how our conflict and insecurity are affecting agricultural production, perhaps also the work of ATA. How do you see that linkage? What are some of the most troubling aspects of that? Are there ways around that violence, that insecurity that we see in Ethiopia as well as in other parts of the Horn of Africa? There's a question by Kevin for you, Simon. I was very interested in what he said, what you had to say about the impact of drought on pastoralist communities. And he's asking whether you think that the biggest threats to herds are actually from the total amount of rain in a season, or rather from the lack of predictability or variability of the rainy season. So whether it's a question of how this is spread out through the year, or rather actually one of total availability. Similarly, there was a question he also asked about international markets, about whether droughts happening in different regions of the Horn of Africa at the same time might affect supply and demand patterns, and thereby, I suspect he's asking, make markets even less reliable of an instrument for adaptation. So if you could speak to that. And then maybe finally, Balkis, I see that you're already on the question of Marco, but a question perhaps specifically about the ways in which changing behavior of insects, plant diseases is impacting African agriculture, perhaps particularly in the Horn of Africa. Your thoughts on that would be much appreciated. But let's perhaps start with Yifru, then Simon, and then Balkis in the order I asked you the question. Yifru, are you able to hear us, to join us?
Yes, Harry. Can you please repeat the question, because I lost some of the questions.
No problem. So the question that's posed to you is about the link between food insecurity and violence, I guess, armed conflict, and the ways in which insecurity and armed conflict are impacting, I guess, the work of ATA, broader ambitions of different governments in the region. How have you experienced that in the last couple of years, and what steps, if any, are you undertaking?
All right, thank you very much. I think it's very obvious. Any conflict definitely affects development, and particularly the agricultural sector would be the most affected sector in a country like Ethiopia, where most of the economy relies on agriculture. So especially in the past couple of years, or recently, the conflict in the northern part of the country has quite a significant impact on agricultural production and productivity. We have had recovery plan during the early stage of the conflict, especially in Tigray. But then when the government pulled out, that was not materialized. So we have little or no information in that region, because one of the regions that we've been operating was the Tigray region, where we have over 29 waradas, serving the ACC agricultural commercialization projects there. We don't have any information about that. In the rest of the regions, such as the Amhara region, quite a number of waradas have been affected. Either the properties have been looted, burned, or damaged. We are currently assessing the extent of the damage, and we'll see how much that would be in terms of the monetary and the kind of recovery plans we need is going on now. So it has been quite significant. In the northern, in totality, both in Amhara, in Afar, in Tigray, over 20 million people are definitely at risk or are waiting for handouts to survive. Even they have lost their cattle, their harvests. Therefore, it's been really quite damaging. So our programs that have been run in Amhara region has been significantly affected. So of all the total 300 districts we operate in the country, about 73 of them, both in Tigray and Amhara, are affected due to the conflict. There are also some areas that we are not accessible that are difficult perhaps to easily access in the southern part, southwest part of the country, but is that is not as huge as the rest of the region. In the eastern part of the country, we don't operate at the moment. So as far as the ET is concerned, we are limited in the 4 regions, but we are planning to move into the Somalia and the Afar regions as well. We've been discussing in touch with the regional government, so that we will embark next, come July. So I'm not sure quite. I'm not.
Yeah, no, that's great. That I think that does address the question that was posed and the way in which, as I said, you're trying to respond in a very difficult context, of course, especially in the northern part of Ethiopia. Simon, the question to you about these adaptation strategies, the role of markets, and then the different ways in which changes in precipitation might affect pastoralists. Any thoughts?
Yes. So thanks, Kevin, for the question. So I would say the biggest challenge is a missed season for rain. And that's what we call a drought. So we have at least 2 seasons that the community goes without rains. That's the biggest challenge for these arid and semi-arid areas, because that now implies that everything dries there, and any water source, any water they had harvested in their water pans dries up. Then now livestock now start dying. So sometimes yes, variability that you have very high rainfall on one night, the rainfall entire season. So that will just bring flash floods, but not a big deal, because sometimes also that water can be harvested and stored in the community dams and water pans. But the biggest challenge, I would say, is missing of the season there. Then in terms of issues to do with supply and demand in the markets, particularly that most of and I agree with you, sometimes you can have multiple regions experiencing drought at the same time. So that's why I mentioned that the future for the livestock production is actually coming up with finishing and fattening. So here now we have a confined feeding of the animals, and especially if you are targeting for export market, so that they gain the lightweight, they have the light prime quality of the beef. And for you to do this finishing and fattening, of course, you need hay, which could be grown even through irrigation in other more highlands areas where we have more rainfall. And then the dry areas use this. And also even the grains that is used as part of the mix for coming up with the concentrate can also come from the highlands areas. And most of the time you find that the droughts largely affect the arid and semi-arid areas, and still in the highlands, there's still sort of enough rainfall to be able to grow some of these fodder that could be used for this finishing and fattening. Thank you, and over to you, Harry.
Thanks so much, Simon. Balkis, there's that question for you about changing behavior of insects, plant diseases, and the way that affects, of course, African agriculture. What insights can you share for someone like Marco interested in this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Marco. Actually, a number of studies on the different types of crops in Africa has shown that there is observed changes in terms of productivity, and especially in subsistence crops like the millet and sorghum. Some are very sensitive to the temperature, Others are more sensitive to drought. And generally in Sudan, for example, the study showed that the sorghum is highly vulnerable compared to the millet. And so the recommendation was made that we shift more to grow millet as one of the adaptation measures. Besides, of course, there are a number of research products that were, the products are like drought tolerant, heat tolerant seeds varieties. So these are also part of the adaptation, to work closely with the research institutes to make sure that improved varieties of crops are being produced. I don't know about the study on insects, the impact of the climate change on insects, and also, of course, in fertilization. I know in UK, it is a very famous study, and actually they consider it as a study that like opened the eyes of the farmers to climate change, because before it was not really an issue, big issue for them. But when they started to see the bees dying from climate change and the agricultural productivity declining accordingly, so they get more aware, great awareness about climate change, and they started asking questions as how can we address this issue. But definitely there are also a number of projections, like for the coffee in Uganda, they say by, I think, 2050, the crops will decline by more than 70%, things like that. I don't have the exact figures, but definitely the impacts of temperature and drought are very significant in Africa as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Balkis, and thank you also to all of you who asked questions and shared your thoughts, your suggestions in the chat. We very much appreciate that. I see that the clock, we've come to the end of our time here, but I hope you found it a useful exchange of ideas, useful setting out the various insights and from a wide range of scholarship and policy experience over many states that comprise the Horn of Africa. Please check out our website, where there will be more events that the center is hosting, including more events in the future on African perspectives on climate and climate adaptation. And let me thank you for your attention. Would you like to see this again? You can go to our website or our YouTube channel. And last but not least, again, a warm round of applause, virtual applause perhaps, for our panelists, Balkis, Yifru, and Simon. Thank you so much for being generous with your time and your insights. I greatly enjoyed this. I'm sure it was the same for our audience, and hope to see you all again in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you very much.
Yeah.